So today I want to talk about policy capacity and model bills. So what is policy capacity? And I'm going to talk about this with you in the terms of state politics. So policy capacity is uh, the level of ability that a state has to pass and implement policy. So when you think about capacity, maybe you've heard the term capacity building in other contexts. What does capacity mean? Well, uh, uh, policy capacity is impacted by a number of things. So a state's ability to implement and pass effective policy. Uh, it's influenced by a number of things. Two of which I want to talk about are legislative professionalism and bureaucratic capacity. So, legislative professionalism. Different state legislatures have a different level of professionalism for the legislature. Some states are highly professionalized. Being a state legislator, either a member of the state House of Representatives or a member of the state Senate, is a full time job or almost a full time job. And in other states, it's very deprofessionalized. So being a legislator in the state is not enough to live on, and you don't work year round as a state legislator. So there's a number of different ways that we measure legislative professionalism, which impacts a state's policy capacity. One way is through the salaries. So one factor is salaries that are made by the state legislators. States that pay their legislators more are more professionalized. That correlates usually with how much time and effort they're expected to be putting into their jobs. And it also means that more legislators are going to be able to focus on being a legislator as their profession rather than working another job and being a legislator on the side. So, so highly professionalized state legislatures like Pennsylvania or California pay far more than the deprofessionalized legislators of, say, Nebraska or Georgia. So the state legislators make less, and they're in session less if they're deprofessionalized. So one of the factors for legislative professionalism is how often are you in session. In the state of Georgia, the legislature is in session for a very short period of time at the beginning of the year. In other states that are more professionalized, they're in session more often, and they handle more bills, and those legislatures are more focused on passing legislation, writing and passing legislation. So that increases their policy capacity, the ability that they have to pass policy to help solve the social problems in their state. Bureaucratic capacity is the size of your, usually measured by the size of your bureaucracy, but the idea is the same. How many resources do you have in the state bureaucracy to carry out the policies that you're passing? So it's one thing to have the capacity to pass a policy and spend a lot of time writing a policy and coming up with new solutions. It's a whole other thing to then be able to implement those solutions. If you don't have, if you want to write a crime bill that puts a police officer on every street corner, if you don't have the police officers or the resources to hire more police officers to put on every street corner, then passing that bill isn't going to do you any good. So you have to have the bureaucratic capacity. You have to be able to use the bureaucracy to then implement the policies that you're passing. So bureaucratic capacity and legislative professionalism influence policy capacity, among other things. But those are two big ones. So, uh, what do state legislatures do when they have low policy capacity um, to solve to then what do they do to pass policies that are going to solve some of their social problems? Well, a lot of states take part in copy and paste legislation. So when you don't have the resources to write legislation yourself and spend a lot of time on it, thinking out the details, you may copy and paste from other states or interest groups. Interest groups will write a bill. Members of interest groups will write model bills, and they will shop them out. You listen to the lobbyists. Now, professionalized legislatures listen to the lobbyists too, and interest groups write bills all over the country. It's not just deprofessionalized legislatures that listen to lobbyists and use model bills. But when it comes to copying and pasting from other states, the leader states, the ones that are more professionalized, that are more innovative, and are coming up with new solutions, they kind of lead the way, and then the deprofessionalized states follow them by copying and pasting their legislation and deciding this is what we want to do. So a state like Georgia, uh, if they want to legalize gambling, the legislature will probably look to a similar state, maybe a state with similar characteristics, so that has already done it before. Um, a state like Ohio, which has legalized gambling, and they might look at that legislation and copy and paste the wording of that legislation and change it to fit Georgia, because Georgia is not exactly like Ohio, and make it fit their needs, and they won't reinvent the wheel. They copy and paste and go. Why reinvent? And part of this sounds not good, because you want to think that your representatives are coming up with new solutions to tackle big problems, and that they're there to represent you, and they're you wouldn't let people copy off each other's homework in school, so why should our state legislatures be copying off of each other? It feels a little dirty, but at the same time, it's efficient. Why, if you're going to legalize gambling, why wouldn't you look at successful policies that legalized gambling in other states, and then make them your own and change them in the ways that you think are necessary for your policy environment? The So it makes sense, and that's what states with lower levels of professionalism do. They look to other states and copy and paste their legislation, and you see that this will happen in certain policy areas. You can watch it happen. You can watch one state legalize marijuana, and then other states decide to do the same, and they write up the bill the same way for medical marijuana or recreational marijuana. They and then they tweak what another state already did, to make it relevant to their state. Uh, uh, so it's not that bigger states with more policy capacity don't copy and paste or take model bills from interest groups, but they rely less on that because they're more highly professionalized. So when you see a policy spread from one state to the next, this is something scholars call policy diffusion. So there's an innovation. Somebody comes up with a new idea, some kind of policy like legalizing gambling or medical marijuana, or the different gun laws, um, like stand your ground, or whatever it may be. And if you see it, voter ID laws are a good example of this too. One state passes a voter ID law, other legislators start looking at those laws favorably, and they take that language and they pass their own voter ID law, and the idea diffuses across the political system, and in this state, from one state to the next, or in this case, one state to the next, and so you can watch which states are looking at other states with similar characteristics or in the same region to lead the way and on policy. The these this policy diffusion, they don't necessarily have to. It doesn't necessarily have to start with a state legislators coming up with the idea. These things can spread through lobbyists that are pushing the same model bill in all of the legislatures too. So it's not necessarily that one state is looking at another state and seeing how successful those state legislators go. Oh, voter ID is a good idea in whatever state. We should do that too. But there's also interest groups that are pushing those laws that have lobbyists that go to the state legislatures and say this is a good idea, and they might sell it by also saying, we did it in this state, or they did it in this other state and it worked. We should do it here. So it's not totally clear how a policy diffuses across, but they diffuse across in a number of ways. There's not just one way a policy can spread throughout the United States. So that's some of the basics on model bills, which are bills that are created by interest groups or policy think tanks, and used as a model that other states then use and tweak and copy and paste legislation, and that's also some of the basics on state policy capacity.